That night, when I stood at my daughter's front door, I finally realized there are places we once called home, but when we need them most, we can no longer step inside. Some pain does not come from strangers. It comes from the person you spent your entire life worrying about and sacrificing for. If it were you, what would you do when your own child turns away? React immediately to protect yourself, or stay silent to preserve the last bit of peace? I did not react the way people would expect, and that decision to remain silent led me to a truth I never imagined I would face. If you have ever felt that you gave too much and received too little in return, perhaps this story will help you see things more lightly. Stay with me. I want to tell you this story. The fire did not arrive with explosions or panic, the way people often imagine. It came quietly, starting from the forest to the west, where that summer had been drier than usual. I still remember that afternoon. The sky had an oddly dull gray color. The wind blew steadily but hot, carrying a faint burning smell, so light that at first I thought someone was just burning grass far away. My farm sat on the edge of town. It wasn't large, but it was where I had lived for nearly 40 years. Every row of trees, every fence panel, every corner of the barn was as familiar to me as breathing. I had always thought I would stay there until I no longer had the strength to step into the garden each morning. But in a single afternoon, everything disappeared. When the firefighters told me to evacuate, I stood and watched from a distance. There were no tears, no cries. I simply stood there, holding my old hat, watching smoke rise from what had once been my home. The fire wasn't violent like in the movies. It consumed things slowly, steadily, but with certainty, almost as if it knew exactly what it had come to take. I wasn't angry. I didn't ask why it had to be me. At this age, I've learned that not everything needs an explanation. Some things arrive as a natural part of life, like seasons that come and go. In my mind, one thought kept repeating, clear and calm. There are things you can hold on to for a lifetime, and there are things you must learn to let go. That farm was something I had held on to for a very long time. Perhaps it was time to let go, even though I had never imagined I would have to let go in this way. After the fire was out, all that remained were ash and blackened wooden frames, and the insurance company said it would take time, several months, maybe longer. I understood. They were following the procedure. There was nothing wrong with that. The problem was that I didn't have several months to wait. The money I had saved wasn't much, enough for simple living, but not enough to rent a place long term. I sat in my old pickup truck, the only thing that survived intact because I had driven it into town that day to buy supplies. And for the first time in many years, I didn't know where I was going. I thought of my daughter. Not because I believed she had an obligation to take care of me. I never thought that way. I simply believed that family, no matter what, was a place you could temporarily lean on when everything else collapsed. That decision did not come from weakness, and it came from a straightforward belief that among people who were once bound by blood, there was still room for one another, at least in difficult moments. I straightened my clothes, wiped the ash from my hands, and drove toward her house. In my heart, I wasn't begging, and I wasn't expecting too much. I told myself, if I can stay a few days, that's good. If not, I'll find another way. I had been through more challenging times than this before. I believed that whatever came next, I could accept it, as long as I didn't let my mind fall into chaos first. Emily's house was in the northern part of town, where the streets were always clean and the fences neatly trimmed. When I parked in front of the gate, I suddenly realized I smelled more strongly of smoke than I had thought. It clung to my clothes, my hair, even my worn shoes. When I stepped out of the truck and adjusted the small bag on my shoulder, my hands were still stained with ash, even though I had wiped them at a nearby gas station. The house in front of me was bright. The windows crystal clear, the porch spotless. Everything was tidy and orderly, precisely the way she had always liked things, even as a child. I stood there for a few seconds before pressing the doorbell. In that brief moment, a thought passed through my mind. I don't belong in this space, not because I was poor, not because I was dirty. I simply felt that I carried too many things that didn't fit with such order. Too many years, too many traces of labor and real life. The doorbell rang. I took a slow breath and waited. Emily opened the door. She looked at me, her expression freezing for a second. Now I could clearly see the awkwardness on her familiar face. She hugged me out of reflex, but it was quick and light, as if she were afraid of disturbing something behind her. Daniel appeared almost immediately. My son-in-law was the same as always, neatly dressed, eyes attentive to every detail around him. I saw him glance over my clothes, then quickly look into the house, where the polished wooden floor stretched all the way to the living room. I spoke first to avoid going around in circles. The farm burned down. I don't have a place to stay right now. I just need to stay a few days while the insurance is being handled. Daniel was silent for a moment, then spoke. His voice wasn't harsh, but it was clearly calculated. This situation probably isn't suitable, Mom. Our house isn't set up for something like that. Emily stood beside him, and she didn't look directly at me. I heard her speak slowly and carefully. We already have our own life, Mom. Things here aren't easy to adjust. No one said outright that I couldn't stay, but every word, every sentence led to the same conclusion. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask anything else. Inside me, no wave rose at all. There was only a faint chill, like the moment you realize you've been standing outside a door for a long time, and only now can you see it clearly. I looked at my daughter and thought, she is afraid, not cruel. Afraid of disruption. Afraid of being pulled back into the life she worked so hard to leave behind. Daniel closed the door, gently but firmly. I stood still on the porch, still holding my small bag. There was no sound except the distant noise of passing cars. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel insulted. Now, what I felt wasn't the kind of pain that explodes. It was like a deep but clean cut. Not much bleeding, just an emptiness left behind. I stood there for a few more seconds, then turned and stepped down the porch. As I walked back toward my truck, an obvious realization formed inside me without blame or regret. I gave a great deal, but I never taught my child how to hold on. I taught her how to rise, how to escape poverty, how not to let life bend her down. But I never taught her how to stay, how to open the door when someone needs it, even when that person is her own mother. That thought didn't hurt me any further. It simply helped me understand something I had been avoiding for a long time. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the silence behind me. I knew that from the moment that door closed, something inside me had also come to an end. Not my love for my daughter, but the expectation that I could still rely on that place the way I once had. My husband died when Emily was only 12 years old. The accident happened at the sawmill where he worked. It was something no one could have anticipated and something no one could undo. I received the call late in the afternoon while I was preparing dinner. They spoke briefly, properly, the way adults do when they don't know how to offer comfort. From that day on, there were only the two of us. There was no extended period for grieving. The funeral was simple. The insurance money was enough to cover the burial and pay off part of our debts. After that, life continued. Not because I was ready, but because it waits for no one. I became the sole support from that moment on. And no one asked if I was afraid. No one needed the answer. What needed to be done was very clear. There was a child who needed to be raised, and there was no one else to do it. I did whatever work I could find. In the mornings, I cleaned a small grocery store. At midday, I waited tables at a diner near the highway. At night, when a shift was available, I took extra work at a packaging plant. The work wasn't dangerous, but it was long, repetitive, and exhausting. There were days when I ate very little, not because I wasn't hungry, but because I was used to saving my portion for Emily. I cut every unnecessary expense. New clothes were a luxury. Outings were rare. I thought that as long as she had enough books, enough meals, and clothes for school, that was enough. Emily grew up during those years. She didn't lack food or schooling. But I knew that compared to her peers, she was always a step behind. Looking back, I understand one thing very clearly. I thought providing enough was love, and I forgot to teach my child what enough means. I focused only on compensating, without realizing that when you give too much without saying anything, the recipient never learns to value it. The distance between Emily and me didn't appear suddenly. It grew slowly, quietly, like a small crack that seems unimportant if you don't look closely. She began to hesitate about bringing friends home. She said the house was cramped and inconvenient. I understood and didn't ask more. When I attended parent meetings wearing my old clothes, I saw her avoid looking at me. I noticed it, but pretended not to. There were moments when I overheard careless remarks. "Mom, don't stand so close to my friends. Mom, please speak more quietly." I chose silence, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was afraid that if I spoke up, she would feel guilty. I told myself things would change when she grew up, when she had her own life, when she no longer had to worry about these things. I didn't blame Emily. I understood that sense of embarrassment. Poverty isn't just a lack of money. Poverty is the constant need to explain, to avoid, to prove that you are not lesser. But I also came to realize something I wasn't clear-minded enough to face back then. By staying silent for too long, I unintentionally taught my child that emotions could be hidden and that relationships could be maintained through avoidance. That distance made no noise. It simply stayed there, quietly, while waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. And today, standing in front of a closed door, I know those years never disappeared. They are only returning, under a different form. Ethan moved into the house next to my farm in the fall when Emily had just turned 13. The house was old, the roof leaked, and the front yard was always messy. The adults in that household came and went. I didn't ask much. In a small town, everyone knows, but few speak. At first, I only noticed the boy standing by the fence, looking over, especially around dinner time. After a few brief encounters, Ethan began stopping by, usually with tiny excuses. "May I borrow some sugar? May I sit here for a bit?" He was thin, polite in his speech, but his eyes were always tense, as if he were ready to leave at any moment if he were turned away. And I didn't ask many questions. I simply said, "Come in, sit down." Ethan began joining us for dinner a few times a week, not on a fixed schedule. No promises. Some days he came early, some days very late. I never asked why. I didn't pity Ethan. I didn't think I was helping anyone. I simply set out another bowl, cooked an extra portion, and left a seat available. Some evenings, the boy ate very quickly, as if afraid someone might call him back. Other nights, he sat quietly, listening to Emily and me talk about trivial things. I let him choose how he wanted to be present. I didn't try to teach him lessons. I didn't give advice. I didn't talk about my life. I listened when Ethan wanted to speak, and I stayed silent when he didn't. During those years, I slowly came to understand something straightforward. Family is not only blood. A family is a place where you can sit down without having to be on guard. Ethan was in my kitchen in that way. No explanations. No proof required. Emily wasn't close to him. She tolerated Ethan's presence more than she accepted it. I knew that, but I didn't force anything. I simply kept that house safe enough for another child to pass through adolescence without being completely abandoned. Ethan grew up quickly. He handled his studies on his own, worked part-time, and left town when he was old enough. Before he left, he stopped by to say goodbye. There were no promises, no tears. He only said, "I won't forget." I nodded. I didn't need more than that. I never expected Ethan to return to repay me. I never thought I had done anything remarkable. I only believed that if, in my life, I could give someone a brief sense of safety, yes, then that was enough. Later, looking back, I finally understood. Some seeds are planted not to see the results, but to let life decide when they will sprout. At the time, I didn't know who Ethan would become. I didn't need to know. To me, he was simply a child who once had a seat in my kitchen. And that was enough for a relationship to be preserved, quietly, deeply, without the need for any promises at all. I sat in the car for quite a while after leaving Emily's house, not because I didn't know where to go, but because I needed quiet to steady my mind. I have learned that when emotions are still unsettled, it is best not to make decisions. Night began to fall. The parking lot of a nearby grocery store was nearly empty. I opened my phone and looked through my contact list. There were many names I no longer called, not out of resentment, but because each life had moved in a different direction. Ethan's name appeared near the bottom of the list. I didn't press call right away. I set the phone down and took a slow breath. I asked myself what I was hoping for. The answer came quickly and clearly. I was not calling to ask for help. I only needed to hear a familiar voice. There are moments when people don't need solutions. They just need something light to lean on so they can stand steady again. With that thought, I picked up the phone once more and pressed the call button. The phone rang several times. I thought perhaps he wouldn't answer. Adult life is often busy, and I didn't want to intrude. Then Ethan's voice came through, deeper than before, slow and clear. "I'm here." I said my name. Nothing more. There was a very brief pause. Then he spoke, a little faster. "Are you okay?" That question made me pause for a beat. Ethan didn't ask why I was calling. He didn't ask what I needed. He asked the most important thing first. I told the truth. "I just went through something difficult, but I'm okay." We didn't talk long. I shared very little, just enough for him to understand where I was, both literally and otherwise. Ethan listened without interrupting, without offering advice. In that moment, an obvious realization surfaced in me. Some relationships don't need constant maintenance, but when needed, they are still there, intact. They are not built on frequency of contact, but on how people treated one another when they were close. When I fell silent for a moment, Ethan spoke. "Where are you right now?" I told him the name of the parking lot. He wasn't surprised and he wasn't rushed. And he simply said, "Don't drive anymore tonight. I'll arrange a place for you to stay. We'll talk more tomorrow." I didn't ask, and he didn't wait for me to. I thought for a few seconds, then agreed. Not because I had no other options, but because my heart was calm enough to receive. Accepting is not always a weakness. Sometimes it is a way of respecting another person's goodwill. Ethan didn't say much. He didn't mention gratitude. He didn't keep score. He just did what needed to be done, neatly and without excess. When I hung up, I didn't feel indebted. I also didn't feel that Ethan was giving something with the expectation of being repaid later. Everything felt natural, as if the order of life quietly corrected itself when each person stood in the right place. I started the car and drove in the direction Ethan had given me. Inside, there was no longer a sense of being abandoned, only a gentle calm. Like the moment you realize that even though one door has just closed, there are still other paths open, not loud, not showy, but solid enough for you to keep going. Ethan came to town the next morning. There was no dramatic arrival. No one knew he was back except me. He met me in the lobby of the small hotel where I was staying temporarily. When I stepped out, Ethan stood up and smiled. The same familiar smile from years ago, only now his face carried the composure of an adult. He was dressed simply, neat, but not flashy. There was nothing about Ethan that would make people look twice, except the calm that clearly showed in the way he stood and the way he spoke. We sat and had coffee. Ethan asked if I had slept well, if I had eaten breakfast. Small questions, unhurried. And he didn't mention work. He didn't talk about achievements. I didn't ask either. Some things don't need to be said to be fully present. I realized how far Ethan had come from the boy he once was through one thing alone. He no longer carried the tension of someone who is always on guard. It was Ethan who suggested stopping by Emily's house. I hesitated, not because I was afraid to face her, but because I didn't want things to be pushed too quickly. Ethan looked at me and spoke very slowly. "I'm not going there to blame anyone. I just think there are things that should be called by their proper names." I agreed. When we arrived, Emily opened the door with surprise. She recognized Ethan immediately, even though it had been a long time. I could see the discomfort clearly on her face. Ethan spoke first, so his voice was neither raised nor lowered, steady and clear. "I'm here because of Margaret. Last night, she needed a place to stay, and I helped." Emily looked at me. I said nothing. Ethan continued, still calm. "I didn't come to ask why she couldn't stay here. I just want to make one thing clear. When she stood at your door last night, she didn't ask for anything. She only needed a safe place during a difficult moment." There was no accusation, no anger. Ethan simply named the action without labeling the people involved. Daniel stood behind her, silent. Emily lowered her head. I didn't look at them. I looked at the front yard where a young maple tree had just been planted, its leaves still green. Throughout the meeting, I didn't speak much. I didn't defend anyone. I didn't justify myself. And I didn't retell the past or bring up years of sacrifice. I simply sat there, listening and observing. One thing became very clear to me. When you stop trying to be understood, the truth speaks for itself. When Ethan finished speaking, he stopped. He didn't wait for a reaction. He didn't ask for an apology. He stood up and turned to me. "Let's go, Aunt." On the way to the car, I didn't feel triumphant relief. I didn't feel more sadness either. There was only a clear sense that everything had been placed where it belonged. Justice, if it can be called that, doesn't arrive with noise. It comes when the truth is spoken without being mixed with anger or demands. I sat in the car and looked back at that house one last time. There was no resentment, no victory. Or only a more profound quiet than before, like the surface of water finally returning to stillness after the last gust of wind. And in that quiet, I knew that some things had ended, not because anyone was wrong, but because each person had chosen a different way of living. I did not move to a luxurious place, as people often imagine when they think of Ethan's help. I chose a small house on the far edge of the other side of town, bright enough, quiet enough, with a modest garden where I can grow vegetables and take morning walks. The rhythm of my life has not changed much. I still wake up early, make my own coffee, and cook my own meals. The only real difference is that I no longer feel the need to prove anything. People around me treat me with a gentle respect, not because I have support behind me, but because I no longer carry the guarded shrinking of someone who is always afraid of being a burden. When a person stands upright, others naturally keep the proper distance. I live simply, not lacking, but not excessive either. I feel content. And for the first time in many years, that sense of enough no longer comes with the effort of holding myself together. Emily came to visit one late afternoon, a few weeks after that meeting. She stood outside the gate for a while before stepping in. I could clearly see the awkwardness in every movement. Emily apologized. The apology was not concise. It came with many explanations, many intertwined worries. I could hear both regret and the fear of losing something she had not yet found words for. She said she had given it a great deal of thought, said she had acted wrongly. He said she had been too frightened then, too focused on protecting her own life. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not argue. I knew this was the first time Emily had truly faced what had happened, even if she still did not see it clearly. When she fell silent, I asked one question, very slowly. "Do you want your mother, or are you afraid of losing your support?" Emily froze. The question carried no accusation. It simply opened a space she could not avoid facing. She did not answer right away. I did not wait for a complete answer either. I continued gently. I'm not angry with you, but I also can't go back to the old way, where I was always there to fill the gaps you weren't ready to look at. There was no resentment in my heart, no desire to fix her. I understand that some journeys each person must walk alone, whether parent or child. I did not cut Emily out of my life, but I did not rush in to save her either. I left the door open, not for her to run through, but for her to decide when and in what state of readiness she should step across it. When Emily left, I stood on the porch watching her go. It did not hurt the way it once did. It was not the relief of escape. It was simply a clear sense that I had let go of what needed to be released and kept what needed to remain. No more, no less. Letting go, I realized, is not abandoning someone. Letting go is no longer forcing another person to stay in a role they were never ready to take on. My life gradually settled into a very steady rhythm. In the mornings, I wake early, water the plants, make coffee, and sit on the porch for a long while before beginning the day. I no longer calculate what I should do to be acknowledged, nor do I wonder how others see me. I help a few people around here when I can, not on a schedule, not out of obligation. When I feel able, I do it. When I don't, I stop. I don't see it as giving, and I certainly don't see it as a duty. I simply feel lighter when I do what feels right. Ethan stops by occasionally. We talk about ordinary things. I don't ask much about his work, and he doesn't turn what he has done for me into a story that needs repeating. Our relationship rests in a tranquil place where no one needs to prove anything. I didn't win against anyone. I simply stopped losing to myself. Sometimes I think about everything that has happened, not to blame and not to regret. I simply look back, the way one looks at a road already traveled, with its share of sun and wind. I understand now that cause and effect do not need to be forced. When people live long enough with their own choices, everything reveals itself. Truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be placed in the correct position, and it will stand on its own. Letting go is not a loss. Letting go is when your hand no longer clenches, and therefore no longer hurts. I have let go of the expectation of always being understood. I have let go of the desire to fix what is no longer within my reach, and in doing so, I feel my heart grow much lighter. Not everyone is born knowing how to love appropriately. Not every sacrifice is seen or understood. But if you keep your heart clear, if you do not carry resentment, if you do not cling to the need to be repaid, then even as you pass through loss or hurt, you will not lose your way. And you may not be able to keep everyone you have loved, but you will keep yourself. And sometimes that is enough.